Welcome to Sleep Science Galaxy. Tonight, allow the outside world to gently fade into the distance. No schedules, no unfinished thoughts. Only you, your slow and steady breathing, and the quiet space opening before you. Adjust your pillow until it feels just right, and let the darkness softly wrap around you like an invisible blanket. Breathe in, slowly. Breathe out deeply. In this stillness, there is nothing you need to do, nothing you need to understand. You are in a safe place. Here, time does not rush you. Tonight, we will not move toward the future, but instead drift gently backward, returning far away, before memory, before light, before everything had a name. Let your mind grow calm. The journey back to the origin is beginning. The primal question. There is a strange moment that almost everyone has touched at least once, even if only briefly. It comes when the night has grown deep enough, when the sounds of the waking day have receded, and the mind, so accustomed to clinging to plans and memories, suddenly has nothing left to hold on to. In that moment, a question appears. It is not spoken in words, yet it is unmistakably present, like a warm wave slowly spreading through awareness. It is not a question meant to be answered, but a question meant to be stayed with. Why is there all of this? And before that, what was there? Imagine yourself lying still, eyes gently closed, your breathing becoming more even. There is no need to understand, no pressure to reason anything out. There is only a soft curiosity, like the way we look up at a star-filled sky without needing to name each constellation. When we say before, we are not speaking of one moment following another. We are touching a very delicate idea. The feeling that everything familiar, time, light, movement, once did not exist. Not a frightening emptiness, but a complete silence, like the surface of a lake before the very first ripple appears. In everyday life, time surrounds us. It counts each beat, each hour, each day. But when the mind settles deeply enough, that concept begins to soften. You may feel this even now. When you are not watching the clock, not counting seconds, time does not disappear, but it loses its rigidity. It becomes a gentle flow, needing no clear beginning or end. And in that state, thinking about a before time no longer feels absurd. It becomes a sensation, as if there were once a moment when every rhythm, every measurement was still asleep. Light is much the same. Light is the first thing we seek when we open our eyes. It brings shape, color, direction. But if you remain in darkness long enough, darkness ceases to feel like an absence. It becomes a spacious presence, a place where the eyes can rest and the imagination can roam freely. In that darkness, the question of before light is no longer technical. It becomes deeply human. A universe that did not need to be seen in order to exist. An existence that required no proof. When humanity was young, both in history and within each individual, we did not begin with answers. We began with wonder. A child looking at the sky for the first time does not ask why the stars shine. The child simply looks and feels something larger than itself. When that state is carried into adulthood, it becomes a doorway to the deepest questions. Not to close them with explanations, but to open an intimate relationship with the unknown. Perhaps that is why primal questions are never in a hurry. They do not demand. They whisper. They wait for you to listen with your whole body, not just your mind. When we ask why there is something rather than nothing, we are not standing before a problem to be solved. We are standing before a vast mirror, reflecting our own existence back to us. Because the very fact that we can ask this question is already part of the answer, even if that answer is never complete. Notice how this question does not create panic if you do not try to grasp it. It is like standing by the sea at night. You cannot see its full depth, but you can hear the rhythm of the waves. You sense that something is happening, steady, patient, beyond your control. And instead of frightening you, it brings a strange sense of reassurance, as if that vastness allows you to be small, and within that smallness, you are permitted to rest. In this space, before light, before time, before even the question itself, there may be only a quiet potential. Not a cold nothingness, but possibility. The possibility of movement, of form, of story. Like the pause before a piece of music begins. No note has sounded yet, and yet every note is already there, waiting to be awakened. And the miracle is this: the music does not need to begin for that silence to have meaning. When we tell this story in a slow voice, with deep breathing, we are not trying to conquer the universe with knowledge. We are simply sitting beside it, as one sits beside an old friend. We listen, without arguing, without concluding. Because primal questions are not doors that lead to answers. They are doors that lead to a state in which the mind loosens its grip and presence becomes clearer than ever. There is a gentle truth within this. The universe does not need us to understand it in order to continue existing. And we do not need to understand the universe in order to feel that we belong to it. We need only to lie still, breathe slowly, and allow the question to drift by like a cloud, not holding on, not pushing it away, letting it dissolve within the inner space like light fading before dawn has fully arrived. And then, when the question dissolves, what remains is not emptiness. It is a fullness of stillness, where every possibility is still intact. A safe place to continue the journey. A place where the story can begin, not with an explosion, but with a very gentle breath. From myth to science. When the primal question settles, not because it has been answered, but because the mind has learned how to rest with the unknown, something very natural begins to happen. Humans start to tell stories, not to explain the world in a strict sense, but to live alongside it, to make that vastness emotionally touchable. In the darkness of very ancient nights, when fire was the center of the community and the sky was the only ceiling, those stories began to take root. They did not emerge from books or laboratories, but from the same place that gave rise to the earlier question. A deep intuition that everything around us is not random or meaningless. Imagine ancient humans gazing up at the night sky. No telescopes, no numbers, no charts. Only quiet points of light drifting across the darkness, year after year, seemingly unchanged. In that repetition, people sensed order. And before there was the language of equations, that order was spoken through images. The sky became a story. The stars became characters. The birth of the world was told as a cosmic birth, a great struggle, a sacred calling. Each culture, in different lands, wove its own origin story, and yet, remarkably, they often met at the same core feeling. The universe has meaning, and humanity belongs within it. These stories were not science as we understand it today, but neither were they naive ideas to be dismissed. They were the first way human intelligence reached toward the universe. When people spoke of the world emerging from a cosmic egg or from the breath of a god, they were not attempting to describe physical mechanisms. They were expressing something deeply real. Before form, there was potential, Before order, there was a stirring. This was the language of the soul, not of measuring instruments. What is striking is that, despite their differing imagery, these stories shared a common intuition that the universe is not a lifeless chaos, that there was a moment of transition, a fragile boundary between not yet and now, and that light, in one form or another, always played a central role. Light as the first greeting, as the sign that the world had awakened. This intuition did not require microscopes or satellites. It arose from living long enough beneath the sky, from watching the rhythms of day and night, of seasons and growth. As centuries passed, humans began to ask the old questions in a new voice, no longer only telling stories, but listening to the world with a different patience. Science was born not as a rupture from the past, but as a deeply human step forward. It did not erase stories, it changed the way they were told. Instead of saying the sky whispered, humans learned to listen to light in a more literal way. Light ceased to be only a symbol and became a messenger carrying information, traces of long journeys, distant origins, things the naked eye could never see. There's a quiet human beauty in this transformation. At its core, science is not about imposing human will upon the universe. It is the art of listening more carefully. When ancient observers looked at the stars with the naked eye, they listened with imagination. When later astronomers looked through lenses, they listened with the patience of data. Yet the deeper impulse remained unchanged. The desire to connect, the desire to know where we stand within the vast picture. When light from distant stars was separated into delicate bands of color, humans did not see only chemical elements. They saw history. Each thin line of light became a small story of temperature, of motion, of distance. For the first time, the universe was not only imagined, but read like an ancient manuscript. And the wonder is this: that manuscript did not contradict the earliest intuitions. It only deepened them, refined them, and sometimes made them more humble. Here the distance between myth and science begins to narrow, not by declaring one right and the other wrong, but by recognizing their different roles within the same journey. Myth gives humans a sense of belonging. Science provides tools for verification. One speaks in symbols, the other in measurements. Yet both arise from the same impulse, a refusal to accept the sky as a silent backdrop. In quiet moments, when we allow a scientific story to be told slowly, we can feel that same spirit return. Science ceases to be a dry collection of concepts and becomes a form of meditation, a sustained attention to signals that are small and distant. When we say that science listens to light, this is not merely a technical description. It is an attitude of bowing before the patience of the universe, willing to wait billions of years for a signal to arrive, and willing to spend a lifetime understanding even a small part of it. What makes science humane is its acceptance of limits. Each new discovery does not close the story, but opens more refined questions. Unlike fear of the unknown, this is curiosity that has been tempered. It is unhurried. It does not need to conquer. It is like an old person listening to the sea, not to decipher the laws of waves, but to feel the shared rhythm of breathing. When we look back at ancient creation stories through this lens, we can see that they do not oppose science, but stand at the beginning of the path. They are the first whispers. Science is the long conversation that follows. A conversation in which humans learn to ask more precise questions, but also learn when to be silent. Because there are things that, measured or not, must be felt before they can be understood. In this quiet space, as the story drifts slowly like breath, we can sense a gentle continuity between the first humans who looked up at the sky and those today who sit before screens, listening to the universe as a lullaby. Though the language has changed, the heartbeat has not. It is still wonder before distant light, still the longing to know that we are not alone in this vastness. And perhaps it is there, at that meeting point, between story and measurement, between myth and spectrum, that humans find a deep comfort. That learning about the universe does not draw us away from our humanity, but instead returns us to something deeply human. The ability to listen, the ability to tell, and the ability to sit quietly before what is greater than ourselves without needing to conquer it. A great discovery, the expanding universe. When ancient stories and scientifically measured light find a way to stand side by side, no longer opposing, no longer denying one another, a new door quietly opens in human thought. It is the moment we begin to realize that the universe does not need to resemble what our instinctive imagination once constructed. It does not need drama. It does not need an explosion. It does not need a stage or an audience. It only needs to be listened to long enough. And when humanity listened with patience, light told us a very different story, gentler, yet far more profound. For a long time, when we thought about the beginning of everything, the human mind naturally painted a familiar picture. A bright point igniting in darkness, a violent explosion tearing through silent space, fragments flying outward like fireworks in the night. This is how we understand beginnings in everyday life. A seed cracking open, a sound that commands attention, a sudden burst into existence. This intuition is deeply human and easy to grasp. But the universe, it turns out, is not especially concerned with our intuitions. As astronomers began to look farther, not only with their eyes, but with the patience of many generations, they noticed something strange. Light from distant galaxies was not merely fainter. It was stretched, like a musical note drawn out longer, lower, deeper. Not because the source was weakening, but because along its journey, space itself had changed. Space was not standing still. It was expanding, very slowly, very evenly, and without asking permission from anyone. Here, a subtle yet revolutionary shift occurred in the way humans imagined the universe. No longer was it an event that happened somewhere, at some moment. No longer was the question, where did the explosion happen? Because when light tells its story honestly, it reveals that there is no privileged place. Every place participates. Every point in space is part of that expansion. Galaxies are not racing through a fixed emptiness. Rather, the emptiness between them is quietly growing. Notice how this idea feels in your body as you hear it. It may feel slightly disorienting. The mind prefers reference points, a center to hold on to, an edge to imagine. But here, the universe offers no such comfort. There is no center from which to observe, no boundary to point to and say, this is where it ends. Wherever you imagine yourself standing, looking outward, you will see everything receding. Fairly, calmly, without exception. This does not make the universe cold, as one might fear. On the contrary, it carries a profound sense of equality. No point is more important than another. No place is chosen as the main stage. Expansion requires no audience. It happens everywhere, all at once, like breath spreading through the lungs, not beginning in any special air sac, but unfolding simultaneously throughout the entire living space within. As humans gradually accepted this picture, a gentle yet radical change took place in how we told the story of origins. Instead of speaking of a past explosion, we began to speak of an ongoing process. Not something that once happened, but something that is happening. The universe did not simply come into being and stop. It is still growing, moment by moment, between stars, between atoms, even within spaces that once seemed meaningless. This expansion is not loud. It makes no sound. It does not shake the foundations of reality the way films often portray. It is so quiet that without light as its messenger, we might never have noticed it at all. And it is precisely this quietness that makes the discovery feel closer to meditation than to conquest. It requires slowness, subtlety, and trust in very small signs. When we stop trying to imagine the universe as an object inside a larger room, we begin to sense something else. Space is not merely a container for everything. It is part of the story. It changes. It responds. It carries the memory of what has occurred within it. Every increase in distance is not a loss, but a creation. New space being born. A gap that never existed before is now added between galaxies, like a blank page turning in an endless book. Here, even the idea of a beginning softens. It is no longer a single moment we can point to, but an initial state when everything was once very close together, very dense, very hot, and then gradually allowed itself to expand. Not because of a push from a center, but because of the nature of space itself. As if the universe, from its earliest moments, carried within it a tendency to open, like a seed holding the impulse to grow upward, even before sunlight appears. This shift in thinking is not merely a scientific adjustment. It is a lesson in letting go of old intuitions when they no longer fit. And it is also a deep lesson in meditation. In our inner lives, we often cling to familiar images to explain our experiences. A pain must have a clear cause. A beginning must be a specific event. But sometimes the truth is more subtle. Sometimes change does not come from a shock, but from a quiet process unfolding over time. When the listener allows this story to be received not with mental tension, but with relaxed awareness, something interesting happens. The universe no longer feels distant or cold. It becomes a shared movement that we are already inside. The distances between stars grow larger, yet the distance between humanity and the universe grows smaller. We realize that we, too, live within this expansion. With every passing moment, the space between particles in your body, between you and the sky, is changing, ever so slightly. There is no center to search for, no edge to fear falling beyond. There is only a process unfolding, patient and impartial. And in this context, the story of origin ceases to be about an explosion lost in the past. It becomes an ongoing whisper, reminding us that reality is not fixed, and that we do not need to cling to old images in order to feel safe. In the quiet of the night, as you lie there and let your breath slow, this idea can become a gentle support, not something to think about, but something to release into. If the universe can expand without a center, perhaps your mind can open without control. If space can be created between stars without chaos, perhaps there can be more room within you for rest. And so the story continues. Not with a bang, but with an opening. Not with drama, but with rhythm. A rhythm that, if listened to long enough, can be felt like a deep breath of the universe itself. Slow, patient, and generous, carrying all of us along. Intuitive images, balloons, bread, and raisins. as the idea of expansion begins to settle in, not as a dry concept, but as a slow movement happening everywhere, the listener's mind often enters a very particular state. It feels open, yet slightly tired. Letting go of familiar images like centers and edges requires a quiet effort, and it is precisely then that the story gently shifts its rhythm. Instead of moving further into abstraction, it brings you back to what is close, ordinary, and warm, as if the universe, after whispering a great truth, knows it is time to offer an image gentle enough for the mind to rest within. Let your imagination do something very simple. There is no need to think about galaxies or light traveling for billions of years. Just hold a familiar object in mind, a soft balloon, not yet inflated. As you blow into it, slowly, you do not see the balloon travel anywhere. It does not fly away from you or rush toward any direction. What changes is not the balloon's position in the room, but the surface of the balloon itself. If you were to draw a few small dots on that surface, you would see them move farther apart. Not because they decide to leave one another, but because the space between them is growing. No dot is the center of this expansion. Every dot can sense that all the others are receding, and that sensation is completely true, no matter where it is. When this image forms in the mind, something gentle happens. You no longer need to understand anything more. The brain, so accustomed to three-dimensional space and tangible surfaces, suddenly relaxes. Expansion no longer feels distant or abstract. It becomes something you have already touched, even if only in imagination. And when experience replaces effort, tension dissolves. The story no longer asks you to grasp it. It simply invites you to watch. Then the image shifts again into something warmer, slower. A quiet kitchen, a scent of flour and yeast, a ball of dough resting beneath a cloth. Nothing dramatic happens. No noise, no flash of light. Yet if you return after some time, the dough is larger. It has not exploded. It has not torn itself apart. It has simply expanded, little by little, from within. Raisins mixed into the dough from the beginning are now farther apart. Not because they traveled through the dough, but because the dough itself has changed. This image carries a very different rhythm from the drama often attached to origin stories. It suggests patience, gentleness, a transformation that does not need to be witnessed moment by moment in order to be trusted. And that is what allows the mind to rest. The brain becomes most exhausted when it must track shocks and sudden change. But with slow, even processes, it can soften, like watching a river flow without counting each ripple. Within these familiar images lies a subtle, almost meditative insight. Observation depends on where you stand. If you are a tiny dot on the balloon, you see every other dot moving away from you. And if you are another dot elsewhere, you see the same thing. No one is wrong. No one is more correct than another. Each position offers a valid experience. This is not only a way of explaining the universe, but a gentle reminder about how we perceive our inner world. In daily life, we often believe there must be a single, correct perspective, a center from which everything should be judged. But these images whisper something else, that some phenomena do not favor any position, that truth can appear differently depending on where we stand without contradiction. When we allow this, the mind softens. There is no longer a need to search for the perfect vantage point. It is enough to stand quietly where you already are. These intuitive images are not a crude simplification. They are a deeply human bridge between abstraction and sensation. They allow the older parts of the brain, the parts that love images and stories, to participate in understanding the universe. When those parts are invited in, the analytical mind can rest. And this balance creates a state that is especially suited for sleep. Not overstimulating, not vague, just enough to let attention drift gently. There is a peaceful beauty in realizing that the greatest ideas are often reflected through the smallest scenes. A balloon in a child's hands, a loaf of bread rising on a table. These ordinary objects hold the power to soften our fear of vastness. The universe no longer feels distant or cold. It feels like a kitchen where dough is quietly rising, or a gentle game where everything can expand without breaking. As the listener lies in the darkness, eyes closed, these images may appear like the first dreams of the night. Not sharp, not detailed, but comforting. And within that comfort, a subtle shift takes place. Instead of trying to understand the universe, we begin to be with it. We no longer place ourselves outside as observers. We allow the images to surround us, the way the darkness and the pillow already do. What is notable is that these images do not ask to be remembered precisely. You may forget the balloon, forget the bread, forget the raisins, but the feeling they create remains. The sense that expansion is not a threat, that increasing distance does not mean loss, that things can grow larger while an invisible connection is preserved. In this state, the breath often slows on its own, not because you try, but because the brain is no longer on alert. Familiar images send signals of safety. They tell the body that nothing sudden is about to happen. No explosion, no collapse. Only a process unfolding slowly, gently enough for you to sink into it without needing to stay awake. And here, the scientific story completes a very special task. It does not merely convey an idea. It adjusts a state. It transforms a potentially overwhelming concept into a place one can inhabit. It allows the listener to let go, like dough surrendering to yeast, like a balloon yielding to breath. No control required, no full understanding needed, just permission. As these images gradually fade, they do not leave emptiness behind. They leave a softness in the way the mind receives what comes next, as if the surface of awareness has been smoothed and warmed, ready to welcome deeper stories without tension. And within that softness, sleep is no longer a goal to be achieved, but a natural result of no longer having to strain for understanding. In this moment, the universe is no longer something far away. It is present in the smallest movements of imagination, in the way your exhale lingers a little longer, in the feeling of the body growing heavier. And if you notice closely, you may sense that your own mind is expanding as well. Not in the sense of scattering, but in creating more room to rest. The space between thoughts begins to widen. Not because thoughts run away, but because the space of the mind itself is opening. And just like the images before, there is no center to this process, no edge to reach, only a very gentle, very slow expansion, enough to let you drift without effort, without purpose. Just being there, as the story continues to lull you deeper into the night. The observable universe. When familiar images have soothed the mind, when balloons, loaves of bread, and expanding distances have become sensations rather than ideas, the story slows by one more gentle beat. As if, after allowing ourselves to understand through intuition, it is time to allow ourselves, not to understand everything, not in the sense of giving up, but in the sense of softening toward the natural limits of observation. The universe now is no longer presented as something to be grasped fully, but as a misty landscape where vision has boundaries, and where those very boundaries bring a sense of peace. There is something deeply human in accepting that we can only see so far. In daily life, our eyes are accustomed to horizons. The sea has a line where sky and water meet. Mountains have slopes hidden behind clouds. Cities have streets that disappear around corners. We do not feel offended by these limits. On the contrary, they give depth to what we see. Yet when we turned our gaze to the sky, humans once hoped for something different. We believed that with enough tools, enough intelligence, we might see everything. And then light, the universe's most patient messenger, whispered something very gently. There are places we cannot see, not because they are hidden, but because they are too distant in time. Light does not hurry. It travels at a fixed speed, indifferent to our curiosity. This is not a harsh limitation, but the natural rhythm of reality. Each ray of light carries a story, but that story needs time to arrive. And while it is still on its way, the universe continues to open. As a result, there are regions of space whose light has not yet reached us, even though they still exist, still unfold, vividly and truly. This idea, when approached purely through intellect, can feel unsettling. But when felt through slow breathing, it carries a profound gentleness. We are not excluded from the universe. We are simply standing within a very specific moment of it. What we see is not all that exists, but all that has had time to reach us. Like listening to music drifting from afar. We do not hear the note just played, but those that left the source earlier. And yet, the melody remains complete in its own way. In this landscape, science does not rise as an all-knowing voice. It sits down, very close to meditation. It acknowledges that there are boundaries that measurement cannot cross. Not because human intelligence is weak, but because the act of seeing itself is bound to time. Every telescope, no matter how powerful, extends vision only within the limits allowed by light. It does not tear open the night to reveal everything. It simply makes the visible region clearer, deeper, more refined. There is a quiet humility in this. Rather than declaring what the universe is, science learns to say, "This is what we can see," with this level of confidence under these conditions. Beyond that lies the possibility of endlessness. Space may continue. Time may unfold in ways we have not yet imagined. Structures may exist beyond observation, not as secrets waiting to be uncovered, but as reminders that reality is always larger than its maps. When the listener allows this idea to pass through the mind, without clinging, without resistance, a very unusual feeling may arise. It is the feeling of being released from the burden of needing to understand everything. One does not need to see to the very end to feel safe. One does not need to touch every edge to feel a sense of belonging. It is enough to know that one stands within the visible part, and that this part is already vast enough to hold life, questions, and even sleep. In our inner lives, we encounter similar horizons. There are memories that remain blurred, emotions we cannot name, questions without immediate answers. When we force ourselves to see everything, to understand everything, the mind tightens. But when we accept that some areas are naturally unclear, not failures, but features of experience, tension dissolves. Like the universe, the mind does not need total transparency to function in harmony. The story of observational limits, when told slowly, does not diminish science. It highlights its most humane quality, honesty. Honesty with data, honesty with method, and honesty with what remains unknown. This is not weakness, but quiet strength. For only by admitting we have not seen everything can we continue to observe with openness. In the night, as the listener lies still, the idea that we see only part of the universe can feel like a very gentle embrace. There is no pressure to keep up with everything, no demand to expand awareness without limit, just being here in this moment, with the light that has arrived. The rest, if it exists, will exist regardless of our knowledge, and this takes nothing away from the value of the present moment. Light has traveled for billions of years to reach our eyes, and in all that time, it has not hurried. It does not fear being too late. It does not need an audience. It simply moves, steadily, faithfully, in rhythm with itself. When we reflect on this, the breath often slows naturally. The body senses a parallel. We too do not need to rush. We do not need to arrive. We do not need to see every thought to its end before resting. In this moment, science and meditation meet in a very quiet place. Acceptance. Acceptance that understanding always has a horizon. Acceptance that incompleteness is not failure, but the condition for continued exploration. And most importantly, acceptance that we can be safe even without knowing everything. As the story passes this point, it leaves no sense of lack. It leaves spaciousness in how we see the world and in how we treat ourselves. No need to force wakefulness to keep up. No need to force memory to retain every detail. Just letting the idea settle like night mist, thin, cool, and undemanding. The universe, in this light, is not a problem to be solved completely, but a picture slowly revealing itself, piece by piece, at the pace of light. And we, within that picture, are not outsiders straining to see it all, but part of the landscape, illuminated just enough. The rest lies beyond sight, but not beyond existence. And perhaps it is precisely in not needing to see everything that we can finally let ourselves sink down, allowing sleep to arrive naturally, untroubled by the need to understand more. Traces of the origin. Once we accept that our vision has a horizon, that there are regions of the universe beyond our sight, but not beyond existence, a very particular kind of curiosity begins to arise. It is no longer the desire to see everything, but the wish to listen to what has already arrived. If light is the faithful messenger, then what it carries is memory. And within that memory, even if only in fragments, the universe has left humanity subtle traces, enough to tell the story of its beginning without the need for cold equations. There is a quiet beauty in realizing that the universe does not need to speak loudly to be believed. It does not need to reenact its earliest moment as a spectacle. Instead, it leaves behind small signs, scattered throughout space, like remnants of memory after a very long dream. Science, at its most humble, does nothing more than bend down to gather these fragments, place them side by side, and listen to the story that slowly emerges. First, there is the sense of movement, very slow, very steady, that we have already touched upon. Not the motion of objects rushing through space, but the expansion of space itself. Light from distant galaxies, when it finally reaches us, carries the mark of that journey. It does not only show where it came from, it tells us that along the way, distance itself has changed. It is like hearing a familiar voice that sounds deeper than before. Not because the speaker has weakened, but because the room has grown larger and the sound has stretched through newly created space. But the universe does not stop there. It leaves traces not only in motion, but in the very fabric of space. Like warmth lingering long after a fire has gone out. Just as we can feel the heat of a room long after the hearth has cooled, we are living within a similar kind of cosmic memory. A background warmth, extremely faint and remarkably uniform, filling all of space, not coming from any single source, but from the primordial state when everything was once very close together, very hot and very even. What is remarkable is that this warmth does not need to be sought in any special corner of the sky. It comes from every direction, like a perfectly even whisper, impartial and unselective. Wherever you look, from whatever hemisphere, the trace is there, patient, unchanged. It is like a very distant echo that no longer carries the sharpness of the original event, yet still says clearly, there was once a moment when everything shared the same conditions, the same rhythm. When humanity first became aware of this memory, it was not a loud moment of celebration. It was a quiet stillness, for it meant that the universe does not only have a history, it remembers. And that memory is not stored in books or legends, but in the very structure of the space we inhabit. Each night, as we lie in the dark, our bodies are enveloped by an ancient afterglow, so subtle we cannot feel it, yet so stable that it forms the background of everything else. Then there is another kind of trace, one so close that we often forget it is part of the cosmic story at all. The composition of matter itself. Not all elements appeared at the same time or in the same way. Some, very simple, very light, formed extremely early, when the universe was young, hot, and not yet spacious enough to allow complex structures to arise. These components, whether found in stars, in the atmosphere, or within our own bodies, maintain very distinctive proportions, like an imprint that time has not erased. There is something strangely beautiful in this. It suggests that from the very first moments, the universe established a basic rhythm, a delicate balance, not too much, not too little, just enough to allow stars to form, reactions to continue, and life to eventually have a chance to appear. When we look at these proportions, we do not see deliberate intervention. We see consistency, a fidelity to initial conditions that has endured for billions of years through all later transformations. What matters most is that these traces do not stand alone. They do not rely on the force of a single piece of evidence. They whisper the same story from different angles. Motion tells one part, ancient warmth tells another. The composition of matter tells another. And when these parts are placed side by side, without force, without exaggeration, they form a picture clear enough for us to sense the direction of the story. Even as many details remain blurred, there is a subtle difference between proving and persuading in a relaxed state. Here, science does not try to win an argument. It does not overwhelm with numbers. It simply invites the listener to notice consistency, to see how independent traces converge. And in that convergence, there is a feeling very close to the ancient intuition that once guided myth-making. The sense that things fit together somehow, even if we cannot yet name every part. When this story is told slowly, in a low, steady voice, it does not sharpen alertness. It does the opposite. It brings reassurance. Instead of a chaotic event, we perceive an ordered process. Instead of a threatening mystery, we find a history with traces. And where there are traces, we know we are not lost in complete darkness. Something has been recorded, even if in a form very different from human memory. In our inner lives, there is a deep parallel. There are early experiences, very subtle, very early, that leave imprints on how we later perceive the world. We do not remember the moments themselves, but we see their influence everywhere, in reactions, in emotions, in choices that feel natural. The universe is the same. It does not remember with words, but with structure. And when we learn to read those structures, we learn not only about the universe, but about how memory itself works. What makes these traces the backbone of the story is not that they explain everything. On the contrary, it is precisely because they do not. They are just enough to say that there was once an initial state very different from the present, that the universe has undergone a profound transformation, and that what we see today is not random or groundless, but the result of a long, continuous, and consistent history. As the listener lies still, letting these ideas pass like very gentle waves, a quiet connection can form. We no longer stand outside the story, for these traces are not only out there, they are within every atom of the body, in every breath, every cell. When this is felt, the distance between the universe and the self begins to blur. Not because we become larger, but because we realize we have always been inside. And in that moment, science completes a rare role. It does not awaken the mind with excitement. It lulls it with coherence. It tells us that this story does not need to be rushed. It has long been told, in light, in warmth, in matter. We are simply arriving later, listening again, breathing slowly in the quiet night, allowing ourselves to trust that even without knowing everything, we are touching something deeply real. The traces of origin, when felt this way, are no longer dry evidence. They become reminders that the universe has a past, a memory, and a continuity. And within that continuity, there is enough space for us to let go. Without tension, without further analysis, it is enough to know that this story rests on a solid foundation. And from that foundation, we can safely allow sleep to arrive. Gently, like the opening of another chapter that does not need to be read in full. The Oldest Light, a portrait of the universe's infancy. When those quiet traces have settled into place like a solid foundation, the listener's mind often enters a very particular state. There is no longer a need to understand more, yet not quite a readiness to let go completely. It is like following faint footprints in the sand and realizing they do not lead to an object, but to a moment when the universe, after holding its light close for a very long time, finally opened its hands and let memory drift outward. From here, the story moves into a gentle territory where science and meditation nearly become one. Imagine the universe when it was still very young. Not young in the sense of immaturity, but young in the sense of not yet differentiated. Everything was close together, crowded into a space that was small, hot, and dense. Light existed, but it was not free. It was born, collided with matter, and was held back again, like a breath trapped in the chest before it can be released. The sky at that time was neither dark nor bright as we understand brightness today. It was more like a thick, glowing fog, lit from within, where there was no direction to look, no near or far, only an even presence of energy and motion. In this state, the universe was like a mind that has not yet learned to think. There was potential, there was vibration, but not yet enough space for self-recognition. Light was constantly created and constantly lost, not because it was weak, but because the environment did not yet allow it to travel. Like a thought that arises when we are overwhelmed, it appears and fades without leaving a trace. And for hundreds of thousands of years, the universe lived in such a condition, full of content, yet without a spreading memory. Then, very slowly, without any bell to announce it, without a dramatic turning point, everything began to soften. Space expanded. Temperature fell, little by little, like a warm room gradually cooling after a window is opened. In this gentler state, the first stable bonds could form. Connections that had always tried to exist were no longer instantly broken apart. There was enough calm for them to remain, and it was this remaining that changed everything. When stable bonds formed, Light suddenly found that it was no longer being held, no longer forced to turn back by endless collisions. The path ahead opened, long and empty. And so, for the first time, Light began its journey, not as a single ray, not as a beam, but as the entire sky, all at once, breathing out. A collective exhale, without sound, without a preferred direction. Light did not shoot outward from a point. It appeared everywhere, under the same conditions, with the same rhythm, like a thin mist released evenly throughout all of space. If one could stand within that moment, it would not feel like witnessing an event, but like sensing a phase change, like consciousness moving from dreaming into waking, not because of noise, but because there is enough quiet. The sky then had no images, no standout objects. It was simply a uniform glow, encompassing and impartial. A light that told no story through shape, but through sameness. What makes this moment special is not spectacle, but subtlety. There was no flame, no flash, only a state being released. Light moved from being confined to becoming a traveler. And from that moment on, it carried the universe's memory, not a memory of explosion, but of balance. A time when all places were astonishingly alike. Billions of years later, after that light has traveled immense distances, been stretched and grown weary in a physical sense, it is still here. No longer bright, no longer hot, yet still present. It seeps through all of space, like a very faint warmth we notice only when we pay attention. And this faint warmth is the universe's childhood photograph. Not a picture of an object, but a picture of a state in which the universe had no structure yet, no fragmented stories, only a shared background. When humans learned to look into this background light, the first response was not excitement, but silence. For looking at it is like looking into a very early memory of oneself, one that cannot be recalled as images, only felt as familiarity. It does not tell us what the universe looked like. It tells us that the universe was once one, a wholeness that would never again be fully repeated. A sky glowing evenly in this way has a deeply meditative beauty. There is no center to cling to, no edge to move toward. Wherever you look, you are looking at the same moment, not the same place, but the same age. Space has become time. To look far is not only to look wide, but to look deep into the past. And at this depth, the past no longer distinguishes. In meditation, there is a moment when one touches the background state. Individual thoughts fade, prominent emotions dissolve, and only a steady presence remains. This ancient light of the universe carries that same quality. It is the background of all backgrounds. Later, stars, galaxies, and complex structures would rise from it. But this background itself remains, unchanged, unfaded, serving as the quiet canvas for every story that follows. What is strange is that this photograph does not hang on a wall or rest in a book. It surrounds us. It passes through our bodies every second. But because it is so uniform, so stable, we rarely notice it. Only when we learn to become still, to observe what does not stand out, do we begin to feel its presence. And when we do, a curious sensation arises, the feeling of being seen by the past. For this light has not merely arrived here. It has traveled through billions of years of expanding space, witnessing the formation and dissolution of countless structures. It is a silent witness to the entire history of the universe that followed. And when it reaches human instruments, or the human body, it does not tell the whole story, but it confirms that the story is real. That there was once a time when the universe was young enough to be uniform, calm enough to leave an imprint. In this slow unfolding of the narrative, the climax does not come through volume, but through depth. The listener is not lifted upward, but guided downward, into a very early layer of reality where distinctions had not yet appeared. And there, contemplation arises naturally. For when one looks into a sky that once glowed so evenly, it becomes difficult to hold on to familiar divisions. Large and small, near and far, important and unimportant. These are all ideas that came later. This oldest light does not give us a final answer. It does not explain why there is a universe, but it offers something precious, the sense that the universe was once calm enough to be remembered. And when a reality has memory, we can trust that it is not entirely random. There is a sequence, a continuity, a flow that we are part of, even if only for a very brief moment. When this part of the story comes to an end, the listener rarely feels informed in the usual sense. Instead, they feel held, as if lying beneath a starless yet luminous sky, soft, quiet, and gently bright. And within that shapeless light, there is a whispered lullaby, that before all complex stories, there was once a simple moment. And that moment, though it passed billions of years ago, is still touching us now, here in the silence of the night. Cosmic chemistry. The first 3 minutes, when the ancient light has been released and has quietly drifted through space, carrying with it the universe's childhood portrait, something else is unfolding as well, just as silent, yet with consequences even more enduring. Light departs while matter remains. And in the brief pause that follows, when the universe is still hot enough to transform, yet cool enough to preserve what has just been born, another story begins. Not a story of images, but a story of composition. Not a memory that can be seen, but a memory written into the smallest particles themselves. Let your imagination soften a little, like waking gently from a deep dream. The universe at this moment is no longer a uniformly glowing mist. It is cooling, expanding. And within that change, there exists a very delicate window of time, so short that if it were missed, it would never return. A window in which the temperature is just right, warm enough that fundamental particles are no longer torn apart instantly, yet cool enough that they do not freeze into isolation. A moment like hands touching, warm enough not to let go, light enough not to grip too tightly. In that moment, the universe begins its very first experiment with the idea of stable matter. Before this, everything was temporary. Particles appeared and vanished, met and dissolved, like fleeting thoughts in a mind filled with restless energy. But now, as the temperature falls little by little, some bonds begin to last longer. Not because of intention, but because conditions finally allow them to. The simplest components form first, the lightest structures, the easiest to bind. They require no long time, no vast space, only the right conditions, the right rhythm. And for a few brief minutes, the universe offers exactly that. For the first time, Matter does not merely exist, it stays. What is remarkable is that this process unfolds very quickly, yet without haste. It is like a piece of music with only a few notes, played at precisely the right moment, then brought to a close. When the window of conditions shuts, the universe has already changed too much for it to happen again. Space is wider, temperature is lower, density is thinner. Reactions that once occurred easily now become rare. And so, what was created in those first few minutes becomes a fixed foundation for the billions of years that follow. If we look at the composition of the universe today, we see the clear imprint of that fleeting moment. A distribution that is not random. Ratios that repeat everywhere, from ancient clouds of gas to distant stars, and even within the human body itself. This carries a strange feeling, that a part of you was determined when the universe had not yet taken on its familiar form. Pause there for a moment, not to analyze, but to feel. Every light atom in your body, every breath you draw in, carries within it that very early history. Not the history of a star exploding, not the history of a planet cooling, but the history of those first few minutes when the universe was still young enough to create matter directly. This means you do not only come from the stars, you come from before the stars. In the language of science, we speak of reactions, particles, and forces. But when listened to at a slower rhythm, this story takes on a deeply existential tone. It tells us that the existence of matter is not a given. It depends on an exquisitely delicate balance. If the universe had expanded just a little faster, particles would not have met in time. If it had expanded a little more slowly, everything would have clumped too tightly, leaving little room for diversity. Between these two possibilities, the universe followed a narrow path. Not the only path one could imagine, but the path that happened. And that path leads to the richness we see today. The light elements formed early became fuel. They waited in darkness for hundreds of millions of years until gravity gathered them, igniting the first stellar fires. Yet, in their most basic form, they existed long before stars, needing no starlight to be born. There is a profound humility in this realization. It reminds us that not everything precious requires grand events. A few quiet minutes, under the right conditions, can shape an entire future. In meditation, people speak of very small, very subtle moments in which a slight shift of attention can transform the whole experience. The universe, in its first minutes, passed through such a moment. When this story is told slowly, listeners often feel a direct connection. There is no longer the universe out there, and humans here. For the substance of the body is not something added at the end. It is part of the story from the very beginning. Not all of it, but enough to say that life does not stand outside cosmic history. It flows within it, from its earliest moments. And what makes this story gentle rather than dry is that it does not demand complete understanding. You do not need to picture the reactions precisely. You only need to sense that there was once a very short window of time in which existence itself was shaped, that your matter is not the outcome of an endless chain of randomness, but of a very specific, very early, very fragile phase. When that window closed, the universe continued its long journey. But it carried the result of those first minutes like a seed. That seed would later sprout in stars, in planets, in biology, in consciousness. Yet it was planted before there was any notion of later. There's a quiet beauty in knowing that much of your mass was already there when the universe had no night sky, when there was neither darkness nor points of light, only a hot background slowly cooling, and within it, certain bonds preserved. Bonds strong enough to endure until now. In a meditative space, this awareness can become a very gentle support. When you feel small or temporary, remember that your material presence has passed through one of the harshest stages of cosmic history. Not because you are special, but because you are the result of a consistency that has lasted billions of years. The particles within you were not chosen by will, but by conditions, and those conditions occurred. The story of these first few minutes does not need to end with a clear lesson. It only needs to be told slowly enough for the listener to realize they are already inside it. Not at the center, not at the edge, but as a natural continuation. As you lie still and breathe, the light atoms within you are doing exactly what they have done since the beginning, existing stably within an expanding space. And within that feeling, a deep sense of reassurance may arise. Not because everything was predetermined, but because certain foundations were stable enough to allow all later change. The universe did not need to be perfect. It only needed to be balanced for a very brief moment. That moment passed long ago, but its echo is still present in every breath, every heartbeat, every faint thought gently dissolving as sleep draws near. The unseen moments. When the story of the first few minutes settles, listeners often carry a feeling that is both full and incomplete, like recalling a very early memory of your own life. You know it happened. You feel its influence. But the images are blurred and the words are gone. It is precisely at this boundary, where memory meets silence, that the story of the universe continues to move further back, into moments when even light had not yet become a storyteller. Not to assert, not to conclude, but to acknowledge that there are regions of reality that can only be approached with humility. Imagine walking backward along a familiar path. With each step, the scenery becomes less distinct. Colors fade. Sounds dissolve. Not because they vanish, but because the senses no longer have the tools to separate them. When traced back to its earliest moments, the universe enters a similar region. There, the concepts we rely on every day begin to waver. Space is no longer a stable stage. Time no longer flows evenly. Cause and effect no longer rest in their familiar order. In this very early realm, the universe does not allow us to see in ordinary ways. There is no light to observe, no structure to hold on to, only extreme quantities, where everything presses against the limits of meaning itself. As science approaches this boundary, it does not advance with certainty. It lowers its voice. It slows its pace. It accepts that what it has are only indirect clues, fragile inferences drawn by extending familiar laws to the point where those laws begin to lose their grip. There is a strange beauty in this admission. Instead of trying to conquer the unknown with bold declarations, science chooses to stand at the edge, observing what remains, like remembering the feeling of a dream without recalling its images. The earliest moments of the universe leave no direct pictures behind, but they leave subtle ripples in the structure of everything that comes later. In those moments, everything feels both extremely simple and extraordinarily elusive. Not because there is too much, but because there is not yet enough to distinguish. Forces have not separated. Laws have not yet taken shape. Reality resembles a thought before it becomes words, a place where all possibilities overlap. If you have ever sat quietly in meditation and touched the instant before a thought arises, you may sense something similar. Not emptiness, but potential waiting to be shaped. Then, very quickly by our measure, yet entirely natural by the logic of the universe. A movement occurs, not movement within space, but movement of space itself. A tremendous expansion, but not a chaotic one, like a breath held too long and finally released. There is no explosion, no debris, only distance stretching everywhere at once. This expansion does not destroy order, it creates the conditions for order to appear. Strangely, during this rapid expansion, the universe becomes smoother. Small irregularities are stretched flat. Large differences are softened, like spreading a wrinkled cloth across a wide surface. The creases vanish not because they are erased, but because they are given room. In that moment, the universe smooths itself, not to become perfect, but to become consistent. Yet this smoothness is not absolute. Even in the most uniform state, there are tiny fluctuations, not vibrations of objects, but of possibility itself. Subtle tremors arising from the fact that reality, at its deepest level, cannot be completely still. These are not errors. They are natural consequences of existence. And these very fluctuations will later be stretched, amplified, and become the seeds of all structure. Here science approaches a space very close to philosophy and meditation. For it suggests that order does not emerge by eliminating uncertainty, but by giving uncertainty a small yet decisive role. Just as in inner life, not every thought needs to be clear from the start. Sometimes it is the vague stirrings, the unnamed sensations, that guide the entire journey. When speaking of these unseen moments, there is no need to imagine detailed images. Any image would impose the familiar world onto a realm that is not yet familiar. Instead, we can feel them as foundational rhythms. Very early, very fast rhythms that set the stage for all slower ones to come. They do not appear as scenes, but as conditions. And so the sense of mystery here is not blind mystery. It is mystery with boundaries. There are things we do not know, and we know why we do not know them. There are regions we cannot see, yet we can feel their effects. Science does not claim this is the final truth. It simply says that, given what we observe later, these earliest moments form a reasonable, consistent, and restrained way of telling the story. In a relaxed state, listeners may feel this as permission. Permission not to understand everything. Permission not to hold on tightly. At its deepest level, the universe does not demand control. It invites listening. And listening at times needs no images, no concepts, only a gentle presence. There's a beautiful parallel between the way the universe begins and the way a thought dissolves in meditation. When you do not grasp it, do not name it, do not follow it, it opens into space. In that space, new structures can arise, lighter, more fitting. In those unseen moments, the universe is doing something similar, opening space for itself before filling it with a long story of billions of years to come. Standing here in the present, we do not need to force our way through that veil. It is enough to know that it exists, that there are chapters of the story not meant for the eyes, but for humility, not for certainty, but for feeling. Paradoxically, this brings a deep sense of reassurance. For if everything could be seen, everything grasped, the universe would be far smaller than it is. Accepting that there are moments we cannot see makes the story larger. It allows science and meditation to stand side by side without conflict. One speaking through data, the other through experience, both falling silent at the same boundary. Not out of weakness, but out of respect. As this part of the story closes, the listener may feel as if drifting in a vast space where nothing needs to be decided. Simply knowing that before light, before matter, before even the first minutes we have described, there were brief and profound moments when the universe learned how to become itself. And our inability to see them is not a flaw. It is part of the design. A gentle reminder that not everything needs to be illuminated to hold meaning. In that quiet, as ideas slowly settle, sleep may arrive not as a break, but as a continuation. For just like the universe, the human mind has regions that do not need light in order to exist. And when we allow ourselves to enter them, without trying to see, without trying to understand, simply remaining, we are doing what the universe itself did very early on, resting within its own potential. The invisible universe, dark matter and dark energy. As we arrive at the edge of the unseen moments, where light had not yet become a witness and concepts were still learning how to stand, a very natural feeling arises, a deeper silence. Not the silence of absence, but the silence of things that are present yet do not speak. From that silence, the story opens into another layer of the universe. Not further back in time, but right here in the present, surrounding us, supporting us, and quietly eluding direct sight. If the earliest moments were a realm we could not see because they were too hot, too dense, then this layer is one we cannot see because it is too quiet. It does not emit light. It does not reflect. It does not send signals that are easily detected. And precisely because of this, science is compelled to change its posture. No longer an active observer, but a listener to consequences. Not seeing the object itself, but seeing how it bends the paths of everything else. Imagine stepping into a completely dark room. You do not see the objects, yet you know they are there because you must slow your steps, because you feel space being occupied, because sound changes when it meets unseen surfaces. At this deeper level, the universe is known in much the same way, not through images, but through effects, not through light, but through motion. There is something striking here. Much of the structure we observe in the universe does not seem able to hold together if only the things that shine were present. Galaxies rotate faster than they should if based solely on visible mass. Clusters of galaxies remain bound more tightly than familiar matter can explain. Light from very distant regions bends in ways that reveal an unseen mass at work. As if there were a silent framework holding everything together, even though the framework itself never appears. This is much like becoming aware of the bones in your body. You do not see them in the mirror. You do not feel them when everything functions smoothly. Yet they shape posture, movement, stability. The universe has a structure like this as well. A foundation that does not shine, does not tell its story through images, yet determines where things can form and how long they can endure. What deepens this realization is not merely discovering the invisible, but accepting that the invisible may be the greater part. That what we see, beautiful, abundant, filled with stars, is only the surface layer. Beneath it, or rather permeating it, lies another reality, quieter, heavier, more patient, a reality that does not need to be seen in order to have influence. And then, once the listener has grown accustomed to the idea that the universe has an invisible framework, the story opens again, this time in a softer, wider direction. Not what holds things together, but what pushes them apart. Not structure, but rhythm. The universe is not only supported from within, it is also being stretched from everywhere, as if space itself were breathing. At first, it was assumed that the expansion of the universe would slow down, like an object thrown upward, gradually pulled back by gravity. But as observations deepened and listening continued, something unexpected emerged. The expansion is not slowing. It is accelerating. Not because there is an added push from somewhere, but because space itself seems to carry an inherent tendency to expand. This is difficult to grasp through imagery, yet very easy to feel through meditative intuition. Think of the breath. When you exhale, you do not push each molecule of air outward. You simply release, and space opens on its own. In this acceleration, the universe feels as if it is in a long, sustained exhale. Very slow, very steady, yet unceasing. What is remarkable is that this breath has no center, no source. It is present everywhere, even in the emptiest regions of space. This means the universe does not merely contain space. It continuously creates new space, without permission, without announcement. And this creation, though subtle in any single moment, accumulates over billions of years into a force that shapes the long-term fate of all structures. Here again, science chooses humility. It does not rush to assign a definitive name. It describes behavior first and only cautiously speaks of essence. It acknowledges a form of energy bound to space itself, while admitting that its deeper nature remains beyond reach. And rather than viewing this as failure, the story invites the listener to see it as a reminder. Understanding is not about filling every gap, but about knowing which gaps to leave open. There is a quiet beauty in the balance between these two invisible layers. One holds everything together, allowing structure to form. The other pushes everything outward, allowing the story to continue. If only the holding force existed, the universe would collapse into itself. If only the pushing force existed, nothing could remain connected long enough to matter. Between these tendencies, the universe finds its rhythm, neither too tense nor too loose. This balance is mirrored in inner life as well. Some parts of us hold on to memory, habit, identity. Other parts urge us to change, to expand, to leave old forms behind. When one dominates, we lose balance. When both coexist, we gain depth. The universe, in its invisibility, is offering a very old lesson. Stability does not come from stillness, but from harmonious movement. What makes this part of the story especially sleep-friendly is not simplicity, but steadiness. There is no sudden climax, no dramatic turn, only a slow, spreading sense that reality is deeper than what the eyes can see, and that this is not frightening. On the contrary, it is comforting. For if most of the universe is invisible, then not understanding everything is not an exception. It is the normal state. As the listener lies still and lets these images drift, they may feel held by things that do not need names, like lying in the dark and sensing the room around you without seeing it. You trust the floor, the air, the rhythm of breath. The invisible universe is the same. It does not need illumination to fulfill its role. There is a subtle beauty in realizing that our knowledge is like light. It illuminates only part of what exists. Yet the remaining darkness is not empty or meaningless. It is where structures are supported, rhythms are tuned, and long stories are decided. The universe is deep not only because it is vast, but because it has layers that do not need to be displayed. As this part of the story gently closes, no final conclusion is offered, and that is its most fitting ending. The listener is not given a definitive answer, but a sense of trust. Trust that the universe, though not fully understood, operates by principles stable enough to support everything we see. Trust that invisibility does not mean emptiness. and trust that, just as in deep sleep, not everything needs light in order to exist fully. In the slow breathing of the night, as concepts dissolve, the invisible universe ceases to be a puzzle to solve and becomes a quiet ground for the mind to rest upon. And within that quiet ground, sleep can arrive naturally, like surrendering into something that has always been there, even when unseen. Lullaby conclusion. The meaning of existence. As the story of the universe's invisible layers slowly settles, as the idea of unseen forces quietly supporting and expanding everything drifts through the mind like a slow wave, something very natural occurs. Not a turning point, not a conclusion, just a return. Like gazing at the sea for a long time and suddenly realizing that the rhythm of the waves has synchronized with your own breathing. The universe is no longer out there. It has been here all along, within the quiet presence of you. In this moment, nothing more needs to be added. No more information, no more concepts. What needed to be said has been said long enough. What could not be said has been left undisturbed. The story no longer leads you forward. It gently places you right where you already are. Your body on the bed, in the darkened room, is not separate from the story you have just heard. It is its direct continuation, through bone, through breath, through a warmth that is undeniably real. There is a truth here that is very gentle and very deep. Your presence is not the result of perfection. It is the result of tiny differences, a slight unevenness in distribution, a subtle misalignment in the earliest vibrations. If everything had been perfectly balanced, perfectly smooth, there would be no structure, no movement, no story. It was precisely those delicate imperfections that allowed matter to gather, stars to form, planets to orbit, and eventually, this awareness to appear, listening, breathing. This does not mean you are an accident. It means you are a fragile yet coherent outcome of a universe that does not stand still. A universe that does not seek frozen perfection, but allows small differences to exist long enough to become meaning. Within that allowance, there is room for everything. Light and darkness, stability and change, knowing and not knowing. Seen this way, the universe is not a noisy machine. It does not shout its existence. It does not rely on drama to assert its power. Most of the time, it simply opens. Distances grow. New space is born between what already exists. There is no sound, no obvious signal. Yet the opening is real, steady, continuous. And in that opening, everything gains more room to breathe. Feel this now, the space between two breaths, the pause between two thoughts, the sensation of being supported without needing to hold yourself up. The universe is not pushing you anywhere. It is not pulling you toward anything. It simply continues to open. And within that opening, you are allowed to be exactly as you are, without proof, without full understanding. There is a deep comfort in knowing that everything continues even when you close your eyes. The universe does not stop to wait for your awareness. It does not demand your constant attention. It moves at its own rhythm, slow enough to endure, wide enough to include. And that means you do not need to keep your awareness bright. You can let go. You can rest. In everyday life, we often think meaning must be sought, questioned, grasped through effort. But here, in this moment, meaning does not need to be named. It exists in something very simple, that you are present within a universe stable enough to allow that presence to continue, moment by moment. No grand purpose is required. No final answer is needed. Only continuation. The long story of origins, of light, of matter, of invisible layers, does not lead to a rigid philosophical conclusion. it leads to a soft feeling, a sense that you have not been abandoned in a meaningless void. You are within a process that is unhurried, non-judgmental, and does not require your active participation to keep unfolding. And so, no questions are asked now. Not because questions lack value, but because they have done their work. They have brought you here. Now, they can rest. Like waves that have guided a boat into harbor, they no longer need to push. If you feel small within this vast universe, allow that feeling to soften. Small does not mean insignificant. A tiny fluctuation was enough to create difference. A very slight imbalance was enough to shape everything. And your presence, however delicate, belongs within that chain of differences, not as an exception, but as a natural part. The universe does not require you to stay awake to deserve existence. It does not need you to understand it in order to keep expanding. It only asks that you do not resist its rhythm, and that rhythm, at its deepest level, closely resembles sleep, a state without control, without analysis, yet deeply sustaining. As you lie there, letting your body grow heavier, letting your breath find a slower pace, remember this: you are not stepping away from the universe in order to sleep. You are moving more deeply into its rhythm. When awareness fades, you do not leave the story. You simply change the way you are present within it. Everything continues. Galaxies keep drifting apart. Space keeps being born. Invisible structures keep supporting and adjusting. And in the midst of all that, you are allowed not to follow, allowed not to remember, allowed not to stay alert. Nothing is lost because of this. Your experience simply becomes lighter. There is a quiet beauty in ending a story without a conclusion. No final declaration, no message to carry forward. Only a settling, like music stopping while its vibration lingers in the air. And within that lingering, you do not need to do anything at all. If sleep arrives, let it come. Not as a shutting down, but as a natural continuation of a process that began long ago. And if you remain awake, that is also fine. The universe is not in a hurry. It has waited billions of years. It can wait a little longer, with you, in this quiet darkness. The story closes not with knowledge, but with presence. Not with answers, but with the feeling of being exactly where you belong. You do not need to go anywhere else. You do not need to understand anything more. Just remain here, in this moment, where the universe continues to expand, very quietly, very evenly, and so do you.